Well, welcome to my third Q&A broadcast. I'm speaking to you from Melbourne, Australia, and I've got quite a few images to walk you through today. So without much further ado, I think I'm going to go and share my screen. I do have a chat pod open, so the first session we didn't get any questions coming through, but I can already see Maggie White is posting hello there. So it looks like the chat pod is working. So I'll answer all of the questions that you may have at the end of the broadcast. Got a bit of a frog in my throat. I'll just take a drink of water. That's better. Okay. So I'm just going to share my screen. So you'll see a little bit of mirrors for a little while I do that. And there we go. Okay, so what you should be seeing now is I've got some images I'm walking you through, and a couple of things I wanted to talk about was what I've been up to in the last month since I last spoke to you. I got the opportunity to fly over to CP Plus 2019 in Yokohama, in Japan. Big trade show. I think, as you can see, the visitor count was just close on 70,000 visitors. I was flown over by BenQ Australia. They had in mind that I should do an advertising shoot with them to promote a new screen, which I'll show you shortly. Okay, so let's take a walk through that. You can see these shots here. The promo shot here of this young woman doing selfies was actually on the Yokohama Pier there. Now, one of the things that was being showcased at the CP Plus 2019, it was the first time that we saw Animal IAF, which is expected to arrive as a firmware upgrade for an undisclosed number of cameras, but that should come in they say the summer. That's the Northern Hemisphere summer, so we could be looking at July, August perhaps for that Animal IAF. But at Yokohama, they'd actually got it installed in a full frame mirrorless camera, and that was the first time I'd actually seen it actually being demonstrated live. Admittedly, it was on two mechanical cats, but I dare say that the algorithms will keep getting better until they're ready to release it in the summer. Now, one of the comments when I posted a little bit of a grab from my iPhone was some uncomplimentary comment said, well, maybe all animals have been unsharp and since, prior to Animal IAF, and the whole thing was a big scam. Okay, so obviously that person had never really photographed animals at close range with long telephoto lenses. So the first image I really wanted to showcase was this black buzzard flying at a sanctuary that I photographed using the 400 f2.8 prime lens, the GM lens. And you can see quite clearly if I'm photographing this buzzard with say an f4 or f2.8 aperture, there is no way that I'm going to get all of that bird sharp because of a depth of field. And so some people admired my skill at getting the bird's eye sharp and tracking that across the frame. I have to say there were many instances where I failed to do that accurately because what you're trying to do then is put a very small focus point on a fast, rapidly moving target. And if Animal IF can automatically pick up that point without you having to use a small focus point, then I'm all for that. And I think every photographer who has specialized in maybe bird photography or just animal photography did actually recognize the value of having something like Animal IAF. I've often tracked dogs running towards me on the beach, and as you can see here is another dog running on the beach. Now, obviously at a great distance, you are going to get the whole dog sharp, and so where the focus point is not that critical. But often with these dogs running towards me, and I often work with the owners to throw things towards the camera, typically balls or sticks, as soon as the dogs get very close to me, which is when you get the most dramatic figure ground separation because of the depth of field. Often I've got the tip of the nose of the dog sharp, but the eyes are a little bit soft. So again, I don't really want to stop down to f8 or the A7 III and the A9 cameras support f11 with phase detect autofocus tracking. A lot of people have not realized that on the A7R III you shouldn't really stop down below f8, otherwise you'll lose your phase detect autofocus. Basically what it does, the A7R III, if you were shooting at f11, would lock on focus on the first shot and then keep the focus at that original point. So your whole burst would pretty much be unsharp after the first image. Okay, so another point, and I'm just thinking off the top of my head here, is I have seen a very popular reviewer in America claiming that the burst rates of these Sony cameras is not what Sony advertises. In fact, he goes on to say all of the manufacturers lie about their burst rates, where I'm reliably getting 8 frames per second in high mode on the A7 III, A7R III cameras, and I do get the 20 frames per second on the A9 in the high rate there. And I think what this one reviewer was doing, he was fiddling with the release settings and putting it onto AF rather than balanced emphasis or release. If you are going to get that really high frame rates, you need to set that to release, and I cover that in some of my movies. Okay, so that was talking about the Animal IAF at CP Plus 2019, and they let users hold the camera and shoot those mechanical cats. I was considering joining the queue, but the queue is quite long, so I just took pictures of people using the camera instead. Okay, so we went out scouting after the first session at CP Plus 2019 with the director of BenQ Australia. We were looking for possible location shots for a future portrait shoot. Now, the weather wasn't fabulous. Well, I say it wasn't fabulous for sunbaking, let's say. It's late February. Japan is still coming out of winter there. So one of the difficulties for photographers to work with is as they say, there's no such thing as bad weather for a photographer, or just different opportunities. For instance, a very grey day or light rain is absolutely perfect for rainforests. But perhaps when you're trying to get a model shoot on a pier, the situation is less than ideal unless you start using introduced lighting. I've grabbed this portrait of this Japanese woman taking a photo off the end of the pier just to show you the weather conditions. I was being filmed by a guy from BenQ who was, I was talking to him about how I would scout various locations. And one of the things that I was mentioning to him is if the sky is not working with you, you can just simply frame up images without the sky at all. So I proceeded to take a series of images showing how we can actually do that. And already you can see how I can work a scene. Removing that grey, uninteresting sky. Sometimes a very stormy sky can look very powerful, threatening, but when it's just a blanket grey, it is quite a difficult space or a shape to actually work with in the image. It provides nice, soft, flat lighting for portraiture, but as a dynamic element within a frame, it can work against you. So I started looking for higher vantage points and looking slightly down to frame up bits of the architecture. The pier at Yokohama was a very attractive place, lots of design elements. So anybody interested in architecture would have loved working on this pier. Okay, I'm just going to look at, I did say I'd answer questions at the end, but James has just fired a question. Learning how to shoot birds in flight, it is more optimal to use lower f-stops. Said that the SEL 7300 supports down to f5.6 at 300 millimeters, or stop down to say f8, let's say in good lighting conditions. Obviously, some people do want to stop down when shooting birds so they can get, if the birds are close, obviously we want all of the wings sharp as well. But that does pose problems. Often a lot of focus tracking does start to deteriorate the more we stop down. Remember, mirrorless cameras do focus through their closed down aperture, and so in very low ambient light, focus tracking can be a little bit more unreliable. Things are about to improve, I have to say. They're announcing with the new firmware upgrade for the A9 that we'll be able to stop down as much as f16, but I'd really only promote that in where the level of ambient light is very high, such as on sunny days. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the other images I was captured on the Yokohama International Ferry Terminal here. Again, you can see with me removing the sky, I can build up the design of the image, not having to factor in that grey sky there. Having a grey sky at the top of the image would lead the viewer's eye up to the top of the image and then out of the frame. So we could probably do graduated filters either in camera or in post, but I'd prefer maybe just to frame this out. I'm using a short telephoto lens, 100mm lens. I got the Sony's 100 STF lens on sort of semi-permanent loan here. A lot of people don't really understand how this STF lens works and what it does contribute to the look of an image. So I'm going to do a movie review when I've got enough images compiled to showcase the strengths of this particular GM lens. Okay, and grabbing a bit of a decisive street shot there. Often I will use the 35mm lens for shooting street. It's sort of the traditional focal length. You're not restricted, of course. You could shoot street with a 400mm prime or a fisheye lens, but 35mm is the traditional angle of view. So I'm obviously a little bit further back, and I'm flattening out the depth of the images by using a short telephoto lens. A nice thing about the tracking, I think I was using the A9 on this one. Nice thing about tracking on the Sony cameras, the mirrorless cameras, they're superbly quick at picking up a moving subject and then and giving you good focus tracking, which is why I always encourage people to put action settings into one of their memories, so that if they are shooting portrait or landscape, I was doing a lot of sort of landscape type images on this pier, but if you see a burst of action, you can just quickly move your shoot mode dial to your action group of settings and fire off a couple of shots, knowing that you've got a very good chance of picking up that subject. Often the cameras are helped by having backgrounds that are are not too similar to the subject that you're tracking. And another way of increasing the reliability of tracking is just to change your angle of view to the subject. It always dismays me when some people wonder why their tracking wasn't very reliable, and you look at their image and the subject is incredibly similar to the background or very close to the background elements. And in years gone by, the lock-on often can jump ship in these instances because it's not absolutely sure what the subject is. But this is again going to be resolved if you get a chance to play with the A6400. They've increased the algorithms or what the camera is reading to define what the subject actually is. So they've fed in pattern into the mix of color and tone. And so it's just one extra piece of information that it can work with to decide what the subject is. So it's less likely to jump ship. If you've looked at my focus area movie, you'll see that I do promote that you don't use the lock-on options as your first port of call. Only use the lock-on if you've got an obstacle that might get in the way of your subject, or if you're trying to track, say, one player on a football field and one specific player is the important player. That's when you choose the lock-on options. But all the other times I just choose a wide or a zone focus area, because the algorithms for choosing front and center inside of that focus area are very reliable. Okay, so let's take a look at some more images there, just doing an off-center composition, really just playing with shape and line, which is something that I'm sure a lot of you do with architecturally based shots. This is Jeremy from Image Science explaining something to Sean from BenQ, using a good hand gesture there, just caught it in the corner of the image there, and just use that as a focal point for the image. We often use something called leading lines to take an image, take a viewer's eye through the image and lead them on a journey. So I would imagine the viewer's eye to be drawn along the lines of the boardwalk in the foreground, and then pulled over to the right-hand side with that horizontal line going from mid-frame over to the two characters top right. So sometimes a lot of this is just fine-tuned in post by your cropping. Sometimes you're just lucky and you actually see it in frame, and you can frame it in camera. Okay, so looking at a more traditional use of that street genre, and I've got a movie on this, as you may not have, or you may have seen this movie. It's my recommended settings for shooting street. I often do get a negative comment on some of these movies, because I think some people think that I'm preaching that there is only one group of settings for any one genre, and I don't really mean to straitjacket people's creativity. But it's just I want to create groups of settings as sometimes a starting point for photographers, and then modify some settings depending on the situation that they find. But having a group of settings you can go to, having that starting point, certainly fast tracks a way of getting somebody close to a group of settings that sort of fits the genre. So what I choose as my street settings, which and I sort of was inspired by the sort of street photography genre of New York, which is shooting on sunny days in the city, where we get deep shadows where the sun doesn't shine, and I can often replicate that sort of New York street look in the CBD, the Central Business District of Melbourne. Now, one of the things that I would do on a sunny day is I wouldn't bother letting the camera try and work out the appropriate exposure. I would just simply work to the sunny 16 rule. And the Sunny 16 rule basically states that at f16, 100 ISO, 100th of a second, your exposure will be correct for anything in the sun, not in the shade. And so if you've got a woman in a white dress in the sunshine and you're using the Sunny 16 rule, then you're pretty much guaranteed, well, you are guaranteed of not blowing out those brightest of highlights. So it's a very safe way of doing exposure, manual exposure on these situations. Okay, so what I've done is I've adapted that Sunny 16 rule, because I don't want to use 100th of a second. I want to use something that will freeze walking people. So if you use 500th of a second and 500 ISO, then you would actually still be using the Sunny 16 rule. And obviously, if you don't need that f16 for that depth of field, then you can just adapt that. You could be using a Sunny 16 rule using f11. It's the rule of exposure that's the important thing to take away from that. Often with landscape photography, I'm actually opening up the shadows in post. I'm increasing the shadow slider so I can see rich detail in the shadows. In my street photography in the sunshine, I often do the reverse. I often put the shadow slider lower to sort of block in the shadows, to create much more of a dramatic sort of a high contrast look, which is something that I prefer. So again, that's just a subjective choice there. But you can see in this particular image, the Sunny 16 rules works quite well. One of the things that I do advise people with street is not to follow people around in the street. You don't look for the interesting person and then follow them. Is you find the interesting stage in your street scene. Find a patch of light where maybe long shadows will fall up against the wall. Try and find the stage, and then just wait and allow people to walk into your shot. You don't need to pan the camera with them, because if you're using, say, a 500th of a second, the shutter speed will freeze anybody who's walking through your shot. And you tend not to get a lot of negative comments from people because they just think you're shooting the brick wall or the street scene, and they're just happening to walk through. Often, sometimes you'll get people wanting to walk around the back of you because they see you're framing up something, and you can just wave them through and then take their picture anyway. Sometimes choosing silent shooting is a way of not advertising the fact that you have taken their picture, and sometimes using the flip screen, so looking down on the camera is another way of not sort of advertising that you're taking their specific picture. Okay, so as you can see, I've got a lot of pictures sort of in this genre up on my Flickr Pro account. I've got an album just on street shots. I do mix it up, however. As I said before, I'll often choose this sort of standard focal range, that 35mm or equivalent look, but I'll often shoot this with short telephoto with wide aperture just to mix it up a little bit. And this is another case of choosing the scene and then just waiting 5 or 10 minutes waiting for somebody to walk through and occupy the exact same spot. There are a couple of graduated filters in this scene just to darken down the sky, and that's again just to stop the viewer's eye going out of the top of the frame. I really want the bridge to be the brightest thing in the shot, which holds people in the center of the image, and then they can just look at that focal point, which is the guy with the pram there. Okay, if you go to my website and go to the downloads sections and you look for tutorials, you'll see that there's a number of post-production tutorials where I actually allow people to download a raw file so they can walk through the project. You can start and stop the movie, and with your own DNG, which is my file, you can walk your way through the post-production workflow. And then when you're comfortable with that workflow, you can apply that same workflow to your own images. And so one of the workflows that I've outlined on my website is this one, this street scene here. Again, I've just framed up this particular vantage point, and then I'm just waiting for people to walk into the shot. This was a bit of a gift, this one. I was about to do a workshop on street photography, and this was really, I couldn't have staged this better. Just that girl walking up the steps in the sun and her parents walking up in the shadow. There's a little bit of a color marriage between the flowers that the mother is carrying and the girl's dress. The post-production workflow, you'll see that the image starting out doesn't look a lot like this. I've actually worked the colors of this image to really make sure that the viewer's attention just stays on what I want them to look at. So I'm sort of limiting the color palette, and it's a technique that I use by lowering the vibrance slider and increasing the saturation slider. And the tutorial will explain why I'm using two sliders and moving them in different directions. Vibrance and saturation appear to do a pretty similar thing, but when you move them in different directions on the same image, you can get some quite interesting effects. Okay, so let's take a look at another sort of street aspect. The other lens that I'm trying to get on a long-term loan from Sony is their new 24 1.4 GM. It's actually not that new. It's probably 6 months old or more now. It's a lens, but I'm wanting to put into my own personal kit. Typically, I've not really valued ultra-wide aperture, wide-angle lenses because it's often quite difficult to get figure and ground separation through depth of field with wide-angle lenses. Typically, I'm using wide-angle lens for landscape and short telephotos to get that figure ground separation. But I'm quite keen to do some more work with this 24 at its maximum aperture, 1.4. It is a very bright aperture, and you can see in this particular shot that I took in a park in Japan at CP Plus 2019 that I am getting enough figure ground separation to separate this guy from the park in the background. This guy only just appeared to pray for a very short period of time in front of this Buddhist statue. And but again, you know, having your camera set up with the right settings, which is why I promote those settings so much, is I can quickly turn the dial, raise the camera, take a couple of shots, maybe move my vantage point 1 or 2 steps, take another couple, and I'm pretty much guaranteed that I have the shot. I would have been using things like IAF and my focus tracking options there just to ensure that I got the shot. One of the things that when you're looking at this image, and I'm not too sure whether you'll be immediately aware But again, it's using a little bit of the technique that I used in that tutorial that you can download. Is again, I'm sort of limiting the color palette. And one of the ways, another way that I'm doing this is a technique called split toning. You can find that in the Lightroom panel, also Adobe Camera Raw. Hollywood is a big fan of this this grading technique, which is where you feed in one color into the highlights, typically a warm color, and then you feed in a complementary color into the shadows. You can keep it quite subtle so it's not very obvious, but it does create a little bit of a mood to your images, and again it limits the color palette just a little bit. I just took a couple of steps closer. I often always grab one a little bit further away just in case the scene disappears, like he moves on. So I'll always get that slightly wider shot first before taking another couple of steps closer to my subject. And again, you have to remember, as we take a couple of steps closer, depth of field does decrease, so I can drop that background even using a wide angle lens if I can move a little bit closer. Okay, so this was the hero shot, or one of the hero shoot that I went on. We're actually at a temple in Tokyo now, and a model was hired, and I had to pick the color of kimono that she would be wearing. And because it was for a shoot for BenQ, it was to advertise their color accurate monitors. Now their monitors, their color accurate monitors have a color gamut that is like 99% Adobe RGB. Most monitors are sRGB monitors. They work around that limited color gamut. And so when you have very saturated colors that you're editing on a monitor, often the fine detail in the colors that you're editing you can't actually see on a monitor with a limited color gamut. If you desaturate the very saturated colors, you can see that there is detail in the fabric, but if you wind the saturation back up, you lose the detail in the fabric. Now, the reason that it's important to see both detail and saturation is so that we can, when we're preparing images for the print industry, CMYK, they'll have a different gamut again to sRGB or Adobe RGB. So we need to see the information that the file holds, and then work out how much of the information can be put through to the output workflow, whether it be a monitor or whether it be a print industry. The print industry always has the opportunity to add additional colors to CMYK, often referred to as spot colors, to increase the color gamut. So what BenQ had on this stand at BenQ, and it's still a product in preparation, is one of their color accurate 24-inch monitors, which can be put in a Pelican case and wheeled into location. So we actually had their 24-inch monitor on location. They call it accurate color on the go. That's the term that they're referring to that, and we should see that product release perhaps this year. Okay, so as I was just setting up for my my plan shoot, which was going to be a little bit further back than this particular shot, this shot again is shot with the 100 STF. And if you turn your eye to the bottom right-hand corner of this particular image, you'll see what the STF is actually doing with bokeh. It's got this very smooth rendition, especially if we get some highlights or bokeh balls there. They're beautifully presented, even when they go out to the corners of the image. We don't get cat's eye bokeh on an STF lens, which is one of the advantages of this STF. 100 millimeters, it's ideal for portraiture, so it's worth a look at if you're interested in alternative bokeh, maybe to the 85 and 135 primes. Okay, so the monitor that I'm currently using is an SW271. Look, I don't want to make this an advert about monitors, and I'm sure most of you have probably already got good monitors, but it always disturbs me when perhaps somebody's got an A7R III or an A9 camera, And the best monitor they've got access to is maybe a 13-inch laptop, which is not even 2.5K. It's just HD monitor, and the colors are not very accurate on there. I'm thinking, you know, if you're capturing these beautiful, rich images, rich in color and detail, when do you actually get to see this information? So, you know, I think just a small investment, for instance, the 24-inch BenQ is cheaper than the price of a Sony kit lens for the full frame cameras. So I think before buying your fourth or fifth lens, I possibly would invite you to just look at the monitor you're using and talk to a specialist who maybe sells monitors to get an idea of what would suit your workflow specifically. Okay, so this is the actual shot that I captured. We were pressed a little bit in this location. It was a sunny Saturday in a Tokyo park, and it looked like the contents of 4 football crowds had entered the park at the same time as me. So I had to scout out very quickly, because the model was on her way, a quiet corner in the park. I actually found one. I was also aware that the security guards in the park didn't really want tripods or lighting equipment. We had a 24-inch monitor mounted into a Pelican case open, also on the situation. So we had to do this quite quickly. Now, the advantage of working on this shoot with the staff member from BenQ, and also I was using Jeremy from Image Science as the art director. We could stand around the 24-inch monitor and direct the shoot rather than just working on the back of the screen of the camera, which is less than ideal when you're trying to work out a specific type of shoot. I'll just walk you through this shoot. I actually shot this with a 55mm the Zeiss lens here. It just gave me the right angle of view, and I decided to shoot this wide open at the f1.8 aperture. The first thing I did was I put this camera on a tripod. The workflow I'm using is called a fixed position composite. And again, if you go down to the downloads section of my website, tutorials, again, you'll find this is one of my compositing workflows. In fact, it's the first one. And this one walks you through this particular workflow. Okay, so basically you lock off, you're shooting in manual exposure, so the exposures don't vary between the same shots. Most of you have probably worked out that this is the same model, it's not her twin. And so the idea with this one is we quickly did a couple of shots and assembled them on location. This is a sort of a typical advertising workflow done with a client or an art director in situ, and we have to make sure that every shot is okay. And we do what's called a rough composite to make sure that the client is happy before the model disappears, and maybe any set that we've designed also gets pulled down. So typical workflow is an advertising photographer taking one of these monitors into location. So I actually just take a second shot of the model, sort of handing the umbrella to herself. That might not be immediately obvious, but I actually quite like the little shape on the top of the umbrella, and I thought a little bit of ambiguity wouldn't be a bad thing. Now, what I'm doing here is the ambient exposure is actually 1 2/3 of a stop under exposed, because I'm popping a single HVL-F45RM flash through a big diffuser, which is handheld. We're not using any lighting stands, and the 45RM can supply enough light in this situation to light the whole model. We are working with a 1.8 aperture, so even though we're using a lighting modifier and it's lighting a whole model, the 45 on location is still up to the task. Now, I did have 2 choices here. In order to get the ambient exposure underexposed, I had to choose whether to go into high speed sync, okay, which is an option to underexpose the background, i.e. using a shutter speed faster than the maximum sync speed of 1/250th, or, and this is the option that I did take, is I added an ND8 filter in front of the 55 lens. This allows me to use, obviously the flash has to work harder because we're decreasing the amount of light coming through the lens, but often when models are looking towards the flash, looking at a flash flash that doesn't go into high-speed sync is actually easier on their eyes. A lot of models actually notice a flash going in high-speed sync because it tends to strobe, and it sort of dazes them when the flash goes off a little bit more than just a quick flash. Anyway, that's the workflow I chose to use. You might just choose to use high-speed sync instead. Okay, so just to walk you through this workflow, here's my first shot. Okay, so I'm using, typically I would lock off the focus as well into manual focus. But in this instance, I chose to use IAF and then tried to position the model at exactly the same distance from the camera. If you don't get the background the same degree blurry, then that is going to be a sort of a problem in post-production. Okay, so there is the second shot, just moving the model around, getting it to stand at the same distance, take that second shot. You'll see now I've put both of the files into Photoshop as layers. There's no need to align these layers because the camera hasn't moved. I've used a remote release, so I don't have to touch the camera between the two exposures. That might put the two files slightly out of alignment. And then the compositing really just takes 2 or 3 seconds because I'm just putting a graduated filter through that layer mask just to hide the left side of the image on the top layer so we can see the left side of the layer underneath. And so just, as I said, just 2 or 3 seconds, we did that with the monitor. Everybody's happy with the shot, and then we can pack up. Okay, so another thing as we're moving on, another perhaps the most important release at BenQ, not BenQ, CP Plus 2019 in Yokohama was the first time that people could actually pick up and hold the 135 G Master lens, which had been announced just a few days before CP Plus started. Now, I've managed to get hold of one of these lenses, pre-production lens, so I could review that. And my review, you probably watched that. My review is already up online, so you can see what I've been pulling out from that camera. Now, I've taken that into a street type situation. I've shot an event and I did a portrait shoot and I did some action. So I tried to cover all bases with this lens. And one of the things that I was keen to compare it with, it was the 85 GM. And I wanted to compare it with the 85 GM. The reason I wanted to do this was with the absence of a 135 prime in Sony's lens lineup, I have been using the 85 in APS-C mode on the A7R3. Now, the A7R3 is megapixel rich, so if I shoot in APS-C mode, I'm still getting 18 megapixels, and you have to remember that's double the amount required for a 4K screen, so I'm not really overcropping in camera when I actually do that. It doesn't really lower the quality so long as you're using say a G Master lens that can pull rich detail in the small areas of the image. So when we crop or magnify the image, we've still got rich detail. Now, what this does is, by cropping in camera rather than in post, it forces you to work at an alternative distance to the subject than had you shot in 85 and then cropped in post. I'd always feel like I'd be standing too far away if I was shooting in 85, but this is the look of the image that I wanted, a tighter shot with that figure ground separation. So I decided to compare the 85 in APS-C mode with the 135 not in APS-C mode, because the 85 in APS-C mode is 127.5 millimeter equivalent with a 2.1 f-stop aperture equivalent when using that. So it's actually quite close to the 135 1.8. We're only a third of a stop out on the aperture difference and just 7.5 millimeters on the focal length. So I was quite keen to see how close those two images would look when shot in those instances. Okay, so let's just moving forward. So this is the first one is straight out of camera. Okay, and the second one is process. So you can see I've just shone a little bit more light on the model. Typically, I might use a radial filter in Lightroom with plus half a stop, just to shine a little bit more light where I want the viewer's attention to look. I might pull highlights down, I might open shadows up, I'll set a white and a black point, but there typically isn't a lot to do in situations where we've been presented with quite soft lighting, which is the case here. Now, this woman in traditional costume is actually waiting to board a tram. The tram has just arrived. People are moving around on the back to get into the tram. And again, I've just had like 1 or 2 seconds to actually take this shot. She wasn't actually posing for me. She's just waiting to board the tram. So again, just quite a grab shot. The camera goes up, takes a shot, and I move along. So this is actually my portrait review. You'll see this thumbnail advertising my 135. It's a 17-minute extended review. I don't go into charts, and I don't photograph brick walls. I'm just trying to photograph in the different situations to showcase what this lens will do. The movie is available in 4K, so you can't see how sharp images are with high quality lenses on Facebook. It's just not possible. The image compression on Facebook does lower the quality sufficiently, so we can't actually see what a G Master lens is doing. So you really need to watch that movie either in 4K or move over to my Flickr Pro account and view those images on a 4K monitor. My BenQ SW271 monitor is 4K, and so I don't have to zoom in to see how sharp the lens is. I can just admire that by sitting very close to my 4K monitor. Okay, so one of the things that I decided to do, because I have tested the Batis lenses, the Batis Prime lenses. Now, the Batis Prime lenses, they're spectacularly sharp like the Sony lenses, but they don't use the rounded aperture blades that Sony is wanting to use on their lenses. And so long as you keep the Batis apertures wide open, then you get pleasing bokeh, especially when you've got bokeh balls. But if you were to stop a Batis lens down just one stop, you can see the hexagonal shape of the aperture in those bokeh balls, and you'd see that with small twinkling lights in a background of a city at twilight. You'd see them at light coming through the branches of a tree. You'd see that shape of the aperture. Okay, but with circular apertures, 11 blades that are all rounded off, when you stop down on a Sony lens, the bokeh balls stay round. So I actually stopped down this bokeh test shot just to showcase what the bokeh would look like if we stop down one stop to f2.8 in this instance from 1.8. Okay, so I took the lens, or three G Master lenses, the 100 STF, the 85 G Master, and the 135 G Master onto a pier, and I photographed the model in 3-4 different locations. I was going to use the 100 STF in all of the locations, but as the light started fading and the sun set, the 100 STF really needed introduced lighting from off-camera flash to continue at high ISO. So I thought I'd leave that for a separate review of the 100 STF and then just carry on comparing the 85 and the 135 G Masters together and leave the 100 out of the equation. This is actually photographed with the 100 STF. What you can see is beautiful smooth bokeh, but we're shooting at a 2.8 maximum aperture, 5.6 transmission value, and so we can't get that figure ground separation that we can using the wider apertures, the 1.8 and the 1.4 of the 85 and 135 lenses. So this was shot with the 135 lens. And then I shifted to the 85 and went into APS-C mode, and you can see a very similar sort of bokeh effect. Some people have been preferring the bokeh of the 85, some of the 135. Personally, I find the similarities are quite similar, especially when you're not inviting the viewer to look at the bokeh. And a lot of clients are not aware of bokeh. They just look at the subject, and the bokeh is just something that is in the background, that is a subliminal thing. A lot of photographers I know obsess about bokeh, but often clients don't even know what the word is, and they're just looking at the subject, and they know the subject pops from the background. They get that 3D separation, which is compelling. It's a very attractive look for clients to get that figure-ground separation. But the shape of the bokeh actually is something that photographers do tend to look at, and clients don't. Okay, so we can see in this shot, some of the online said, "What is the background?" And it is actually a pier. We're on one pier looking out over an adjacent pier, and the Spirit of Tasmania, which is a ship that moves between Melbourne and Tasmania, has just come in, and it's got its lights on. The sun has set, so we're just looking at the twilight. It's a beautiful soft light. And to work in, we're up to about 1,000 ISO now, but that's well within the capabilities of these full frame cameras to showcase good quality. This has been an edited image, so I just thought I'd take the opportunity to show you an image that is before edit. This is the before edit image. There's just been a little bit of skin retouching, and also you can see, if I just go back, you'll see that I've popped the color and tone a little bit. What I'm doing in this is I'm slightly underexposing the image because we got some bright highlights in the background, and I don't want to overexpose those. Typically, I will expose to the right. I will increase exposure if I can, if that doesn't risk overexposing the highlights. But in this instance, with those bright highlights in the background, I did lower the exposure by maybe 1/3 of a stop or so, and then just increasing the exposure in post. And again, I might use a radial filter to do that. Okay, so and then shot with the 85mm lens now, giving you an alternative. And if you didn't see these two images, the 135 and the 85 side by side, I think most people would struggle to look at the differences of the bokeh. There are differences, but there are also great similarities. They're both using 11 blade curved apertures, and we're getting that same figure ground separation if I use that 85 in APS-C mode. A couple of questions online is, would I shoot in APS-C mode on an A7 III? That is, you've got less megapixels to play with. You're down to 10 megapixels. And when you crop into a 16:9 aspect ratio, you lose another one of those megapixels. So you got about 9, and you're looking at 8.3 for 4K. So you don't have a lot of room to crop again in post if a 4K image is the output that you're looking for. Okay, so it's still good enough for quite a large, say a 10, 12-inch print, maybe even, leaning towards a double page spread, so long as you don't have to crop. A lot more comfortable choices with the A7R III. It is one of the advantages of the R cameras, is the ability to shoot in crop mode and still have enough pixels to play with. What it does is it does give you a second focal length almost to every lens you own if you're shooting with those R cameras. Okay, so we let the light go down. We're at the last light of day now, so the background lights are becoming much more prevalent now. We're up to 4,000 ISO on the 135 because we got the an extra sort of aperture on the 85. I did find in post production that the 85 was shooting at 2,000 ISO in the same situation. So again, I'll just use a radial filter just to pop the highlights on the model. I'll use a second radial filter and apply an adjustment to the outer area around around, not inside the radial filter, but outside the radial filter, and I'll assign noise reduction to that outer radial filter. And one of the reasons I'm doing this on these 2000, 4000 ISO images is noise is most obvious or prevalent in those out of focus areas. And so if I can, and you don't risk losing any fine detail if you're just applying noise reduction to the bokeh. So I can clean up the image substantially just by reducing the noise in the bokeh, and only doing a very small amount of noise reduction, maybe 15 or 20 globally across the entire image. So it's just one of my little post-production techniques that I use when I am raising the ISO. The other thing that I'll always do is I'll mask the sharpening. I'll always raise in the detail panel of Lightroom, I'll always raise the masking slider. This will also stop the sharpening, applying sharpening to the noise as well. And I'll also make sure that I don't apply any clarity, because clarity would also enhance noise, making the image look noisier than it does. The other thing to avoid when you're shooting at high ISO is avoid underexposure. You must avoid underexposure because every time you add or increase exposure in post-production, you're going to double the amount of noise. If you have to raise your exposure slide to +1, you'll effectively double the amount of apparent noise in your image. So you need to avoid underexposure with high ISO images, because some people are always amazed when they're looking at some of my 8000 ISO images. They're going, my high ISO images never look like your high ISO images. What are you doing? And that's basically what I'm doing. I'm applying noise reduction to the bokeh. I'm applying a small amount of noise reduction globally. I'm not using clarity, and I'm masking that sharpening filter. Okay, so we're coming to the end before I answer some questions in the chat pod. One of the questions in leading up to this Q&A forum was about Sony's new wireless remote commander. I haven't got my hands on one. I don't think any have arrived in Australia yet, but I'm expecting this to arrive maybe when I get to Japan. I'm going back to Japan on Monday. I've got a meeting with Sony in Tokyo, and then I'm going to do some shooting in various cities and catch up with some friends. But I'm hoping to get my hands on this remote. Now, I actually already own 2 Sony remotes. I own their wired remote, and I own a remote which is an infrared remote that you can use as a wireless, but it's using infrared rather than using radio frequencies to trigger that. They both work, but obviously a radio signal is going to be more useful than an infrared for various reasons. Most flashes now will use radio rather than infrared, and the RM, the newer flashes from Sony, are all radio wireless rather than infrared. Now, I think somebody told me that one of the 2 Sony remotes has been discontinued, that infrared. So this is going to be much needed, I think. Some people have been using their phones to trigger the Play Memories app, and that is going to go through an update as well in the very near future. So keep your eyes out for that. It was announced with the A9 firmware, so hopefully it will come in very soon. But this one is, I'm quite keen. Sony are only advertising that it will require a firmware update to use this. Sony are only listing 4 cameras at the moment, but I can't imagine why they probably wouldn't roll this out over firmware updates for all alpha cameras eventually. So hopefully that is something that will happen. So when I do get an opportunity to review that, I'll post a movie so we can take a look at that. Okay, so these are the 4 cameras that are listed. It's the 7.3, the R3, and the 9, and the 6400. These are all of Sony's 4 latest cameras. And before I look at the chat pod, I did pick up a news article on Alpha Rumors yesterday. There was an interview with a Sony official of the Alpha range who is saying that more full-frame long telephoto lenses are imminent. Very strange for Sony to announce what is imminent, because they never have done that. And they've also intimated that there is going to be a crop sensor, another crop sensor. So everybody's anticipating there will be an update to the 6500. And this will be in time for the Olympics. Obviously, the next Olympics are in Tokyo next year, and so Sony want the gear to be ready for that date. I'm quite keen to see what they're going to do in the APS-C space, especially if this is accompanied with dedicated APS-C lenses. I love the 6400, but I'm looking forward to an update to the 6500. I've got no idea what's coming. They don't tell me. Even as a Sony ambassador, I have no idea. But I'm hoping that it'll almost certainly have the in-body image stabilization, but I'm hoping it's going to have the Z series battery as well. Obviously, if somebody's going to be shooting sports on a crop sensor camera, they will really want that battery with double the battery life. 2 card slots, maybe that would require a bigger body. So have they gone in for a bigger body design? Okay, I'm sure we'll find out before the end of the year. Maybe we don't have long to wait at all, but again, I have no idea how soon that is going to be released. Quite exciting times, especially with also on that Sony Alpha Rumors release was Sony's statement that they're going to put in more artificial intelligence or machine learning, call it what you will, to make their cameras more reliable at tracking things. It was poorly translated, but they said they really sort of got the handle on eye tracking, but they can, with machine learning, they can teach these cameras to learn a variety of different subjects. I don't know what subjects they'll be picking, but if the cameras understand what it is that they're photographing, then they're going to be much more sticky at tracking those subjects. If you're not going to be buying one of these new cameras with this new feature, then just check out my Focus Masterclass movie and my Focus Area movie, because it is possible to get these cameras to perform very well, but you do have to sort of switch focus areas depending on your subject to get it more reliable. And sometimes if the camera jumps ship, you sort of have to let go of the AF and then reacquire AF until the camera is back on the subject. And I found that some people who are not used to sports sometimes forget to do that. They're tracking the subject with their eye, but they've not noticed that the AF points are tracking something else. So, some people are wondering why the real-time tracking isn't going to be included with the A7R3 and A7 III, and I think it's probably down to processor speed. The unusual step that I think Sony took, and we'll never know, but I think they took a processor, their Beyond's X processor, or a very similar one to that was in the A9, and they shoved it into the A6400, so the A64 could have real-time tracking. Now, some people have said, but I have a Beyond's X processor, surely my camera should be able to do it, where Beyond's X is just a name. It's like saying I have an i7 processor in my computer, but that doesn't say how fast that processor is. So is it a quad-core i7, or is it a dual-core processor? What is the clock speed? And Sony don't advertise the processing speeds of those chips inside the cameras. And so I sort of, I'm not the glass is half empty type sort of person. So I believe Sony typically wouldn't hold back. If they could put this back in more cameras, I think they would. I don't think a lot of people are negative and they're saying they're forcing us to buy new cameras. I don't always hold with that. Sony have always been good at putting top-end features like log profiles in compact cameras. Looks like their RX100. I know the A9 didn't have profiles, and that led some people to again speculate why were they holding back. somebody published, not a non-Sony person, published an article explaining why they believe the A9 didn't have log profiles, and that was to optimize the processor and the sensor for shooting still sports, and it was advertised as a still sports camera, not a vlogging camera. So I don't know and understand. Again, Sony don't release data on why certain features are included or not included. I'd like Sony to perhaps be a little bit more open in those areas, and I will be talking to them about that when I go to Japan next week. But we'll see. We'll see if that communication improves or not. Okay, so I'll turn my attention to the chat pod now, and I'm just going to, we've got, I've probably rattled on a bit too long, so we'll just, I'll see how many questions. I will go over the hour. This is being recorded, so the recording won't stop when the hour finishes. I'll just answer the questions online, and if there's questions added after this recording stops, then I'll just answer them in the forums. Okay, so let's yeah, so Ryan Soane's talking about the A9. The firmware update is imminent for the A9. They did say the new firmware version 5 is imminent, and the release date is scheduled for March, and we're running out of March, so I would expect that to come in the next week or so if it's not running late. So keep an eye out for that. Now, if you're not understanding what is coming to the A9 in March, then if you go to my blog on my website, I've got a blog post about what firmware updates are coming to the A7 III, the A7R III. That is scheduled for April next month, but we do have updates for the A9 coming this month, and it should transform the performance of the A9. It's already a stellar performing sports camera, but it should really put some distance between cameras like the D5 and the Canon EOS 1 DX Mark II as their sports cameras. I already think the Sony has an edge, but it's going to make that edge a gap, a chasm, if you like, when the A9 gets even more performance without people having to buy a new camera. Okay, so if people want the settings on my images, I'm looking at a post now by Maggie. If you go over to my Flickr Pro account, all of the images uploaded to those albums are all have their metadata. None of the metadata is stripped from the images when I upload them, and so you can just go to my photo stream, which is all of the images uploaded in date order. But if you go to the albums, you'll see images shot with specific cameras, specific lenses, and specific genres such as street, portrait, landscape, and so you can see all of those settings. Now, one of the things that I don't tend to do on Flickr is I don't tend to answer a lot of the questions. I'm hoping Flickr will be reorganized. I get bombarded with likes from Flickr, but it's very hard to pull out the comments. I could waste hours per day looking for the comments on Flickr. Where I do monitor the comments is in this community section underneath my YouTube movies and on the my Facebook forum that I run. So if you ask the questions there is going to come a date where I just can't answer all questions as my following is growing, and this is part of the reason this membership is started. I want basically to support alpha owners, but I can only support so many, and so the membership is part and parcel of that. I will prioritize members above everything else. Okay, so that is so that's Maggie's question. So I have tried using APS-C cropping with the A7 III, not happy with the resolution. Yes, you do only get 10 megapixels, and there's 8.3 on 4K, so you do have to be careful what you use that for, because 24 megapixels gives you generous amount of post-production cropping. Okay, but Okay, but if you've already cropped in camera, you do lose that advantage. Should you turn steady shot off when using on a monopod? Okay, look, let's just explain exactly what steady shot for. Steady shot is designed when you're trying to keep the camera as still as possible, and you're using shutter speeds below that recommended that would normally avoid camera shake. You're basically allowing the camera to go below what is recommended. If the camera is in movement in your hands, then steady shot is not your friend. So if the monopod is being used and you're just holding the camera still, then you might find steady shot is okay. If you're using the longer telephoto lenses, I would still be inclined to turn steady shot off. The vibration of the OSS in these longer telephoto lenses is quite pronounced, and that creates a little bit of vibration that is only picked up through the camera body if the camera is anchored down onto a monopod or tripod. So maybe if the monopod is using a wide angle lens, I might leave steady shot on, but if it's on a tripod or monopod with a longer telephoto lens, I would switch it off. If the camera is being panned in the hands, you need to switch to mode 2 on one of the lenses. This basically switches off the stabilization on the horizontal axis. All of that information is fed back through to the camera. So the 5-axis stabilization on the camera is also switching off its horizontal stabilization. If any of the movement of the camera is erratic, then you need a mode 3 on the lens, and the only mode 3 that it currently exists is on the new 400mm prime G Master, or you just switch steady shot completely off. Basically, if you're using fast shutter speeds and the camera is moving, there is no reason to have steady shot on at all. Okay, so regarding, let's just go back, lost that. Okay, so yes, this is talking about the M1 to M4 settings. You will lose all of those when you reformat the card. Typically, I've got a small 8 gigabyte card in my camera bag that I just use with an additional 4 settings, and I always load them from slot 2. One of the things that will change when firmware upgrade comes to the A9 is we can load them from slot 2 and feed them into the memories on the shoot mode dial, or just load them into the camera and then eject that card. Because if you start recording to that card and then have to reformat that card, you're going to lose those settings. I do have a movie called Total Recall, which showcases how you can put those saved memory settings onto your hard drive on your computer and then reload them after the card has been formatted. One of the things you want to do is if you're heading for a major firmware upgrade, not a dot point release, but a major new version, like we're moving from 4 to 5, is you need to make a record, a written record of all of your settings, because typically when we go to a major firmware upgrade, the camera starts from scratch. You're going to lose every setting, and you can't reinstall saved memory settings if the firmware is a major upgrade. So if we're going, say, from 4 to 5, version 5 on an A9, you won't be able to load your saved settings from your version 4 firmware. So again, keep a record of all of those before you do your major upgrade. Okay, I'm possibly going to run out of time for all of these questions, but I will answer them. Okay, I'll answer Ryan's other questions about formatting in the chat pod after, because they get quite involved. Okay, so do I approve of the stock 4K IMAX screen? Look, the IMAX screens, I always didn't value IMAX screens. Days have gone old, because they were 8-bit screens. And the calibration process means if you calibrate a screen, you move them out of their comfort zone, white balance and brightness, and you can invoke some stepping or banding. But Apple moved to 10-bit monitors with their new desktop computers, and so it did allow them to be calibrated and profiled. But then they moved to 5K, and I think that was resolution overkill. Moving from 4K to 5K moves the megapixel count count from 8 to 14. What this does is it can slow Lightroom down significantly if it's having to write to 14 megapixels every time you move a slider. A lot of people say, oh, Lightroom is slowing down, and what they haven't factored in is they've just bought a new high resolution monitor. So I generally don't advise people buy 4K monitors on old computers. Make sure the computer is running, say, a quad-core i7 with a good graphics card and lots of RAM before you start trying to write to, say, a 5K. And Apple have just announced a 6K monitor. That is definitely resolution overkill. I think you're going to need a very powerful computer to drive a 6K monitor. I think 4K, a 30-inch or 27-inch 4K monitor is a sweet spot for these. One of the advantages of color accurate monitors, I've mentioned BenQ a couple of times, but there is a manufacturer very well known for their high-end printers, which are used in the fine art industry and professional photography and graphics arts industry, which is a manufacturer called ISO. And they're fabulous monitors. They are a little bit expensive, and which is why BenQ is so attractive. Their 4K monitor is less than half the price of the ISO equivalent. But there are other advantages to these ISO and the BenQ monitors other than just resolution. It's their color gamut. It's their Adobe RGB color gamut. It's the fact that it's hardware calibration rather than software calibration. And basically, when you pick them out of the box, they come already actually in the pocket. They're already neutral on color, white balance, brightness values. They're basically designed to be color accurate straight out of the box, whereas an Apple monitor has to be pushed there because they're often way too bright and blue. They're too cool in color temperature to be used in the graphics arts, the printing industry. You can get used to blue-white, and often when you start working with a color accurate monitor, everything looks a little bit warm until your brain gets accustomed to the fact that this is neutral. Okay. Some people get confused about color management, which is why I've put up a 50-page ebook, free ebook on my website. That was a course that I wrote for a university, and that is now available as a free download. It does require quite a lot if you're new to color management. A lot of people refer to this thing called color science because it's a Canon term. There is no science to Canon's term color science. It's just a flavor of color that they chose for their cameras. The actual correct term is called color management, and it was introduced by Adobe into photography in 1998, which is why you see that word on your cameras. You get a choice between sRGB and Adobe RGB bracket 1998. It's pretty much 20 years old, and still it's a confusing topic for a lot of people in the industry. Okay, so let's just look. James has got a few questions here. Okay, so I'll answer these monitor questions at the end in the chat pod. Okay, so is a lack of, I'll just answer this one by James, the lack of real-time tracking. You'll probably see when I did a review of the A7 III camera, I could track fast-moving stuff. I went to rodeos, I photographed dogs running on beaches, which is my default test for a tracking capability of a new camera. You might just think I like dogs, which I do, but because I live near a beach where people run their dogs, this is an obvious thing to test the cameras. Now, you can get these cameras to perform well, but the cameras, you know, like people say, what's the setting you use for shooting dogs running? And I'm going, well, there isn't one. You know, you have to be fussy about what it is you choose. Okay, sometimes it can be a lock-on option, sometimes it's not a lock-on option, like a dog running through tall grass. If the grass is in front of the dog and the dog descends into the grass, if you just trigger the AF at exactly the wrong time, it will lock onto the grass. So when the dog starts running towards you, the dog is out of focus. So you have to sometimes reduce the size of your focus area. Sometimes you have to change whether it's a lock-on option option or not a lock option. I can make these cameras perform with the best DSLRs, but it does take practice, both at your panning skills, etc. But what's happening with these new real-time tracking, it's putting sports capability for people who are fairly novice to using these in these type of environments. I'm sure Sony were immensely disappointed when one of the reviewers at the launch of the 6400 commented that he didn't know what all the fuss was about because his images weren't sharp. And then everybody could see, because he was recording the back of his camera, he'd forgotten to select the tracking mode. So they're not idiot proof. Not to say he was an idiot, but everybody's capable of missing one setting. And so starting off with a group of settings, I would have started them off with a group of settings and then invited them to modify settings if and when they had a good reason to modify those settings. Like, I'd start people off at 2,000th of a second, but if their panning skills were quite good and they wanted some movement blur, I would then invite them to slow the shutter speed down. But you've always, if you're shooting in shutter priority, you've always got to be aware of that minimum shutter speed, because if you go down below, say, that f11, then you might disable phase detect, which is one of the reasons I choose auto ISO minimum shutter speed with aperture priority and don't use shutter speed priority when you're shooting sports. Okay, so yeah, so let's just see. I'll probably sign off because I've gone a good quarter of an hour over. So yeah, only 200 characters for each comment. Yes, there's probably a limit of Google, but here we go. So I noticed the A6400 has a steady shot tab. Why? As it doesn't have image stabilization. It will have a steady shot tab. It's a good question, actually. It has steady shot because it treats the OSS, optical steady shot, in lenses as steady shot. There's two steady shots at play on the cameras that have steady shot inside. If steady shot inside the camera is referred to as steady shot inside, it's called IBIS, in-body image stabilization. And on the cameras, they'll say steady shot inside. But somebody using a 6400 with a stabilized lens will still have steady shot capability. Sometimes the OSS lenses will have a steady shot on off on the lens, say the white lenses, but some of the lenses don't have an on off on the lens, so you have to be able to disable it in the body. And that is obviously when the camera is going on a tripod, you're doing a long 30-second exposure, you don't want the vibration from the gyros in the lens to start eroding the sharpness of your images, so you still need steady shot setting in a camera that doesn't have steady shot. It's a very good question, Maggie. I like those sort of questions. Okay, so I'll sign off here now. Sorry if I missed your question. I'm just scanning down, looking at the chat pod, but I'll go back through maybe later this afternoon and look at any other questions that I didn't answer now. So April's monthly live Q&A might actually be available early in May. I might be a little bit late on this one because I'm spending almost the entire month in Japan. Okay, so I get back in the last week of March, so I may or may not have time to pull together some resources to do that, and it might be late notice. Keep your eyes on the community on the pod. See what I'm announcing, and I'll join you online next month, perhaps with some exciting images from new cameras, new firmware, new lenses, and I'll catch you online next time. Thanks for being a member. I do value your support. Okay, signing off. Thank you.